May I have one more question of someone else?
Why don't we let Representative Squires ask a question? She had her hand up.
You go ahead. I'll
She's going to defer to you, Representative Wilson.
I apologize. And I know your name, but I can't think of it. If I could have you come back up again, the person who handed out this. Thank you. Mackey. Thank you.
Ms. Mackey.
I love Mackey.
Ms. Mackey. I know your name. I'm sorry this happens to me every time I try and say someone's name. I apologize. Mr. Chair, this size piece of equipment would be addressed by the Department of Transportation in previous review of the highways, because the highway was not built for this, I don't believe. So if you could please give us your opinion on that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wilson, no, I don't believe that, and for a couple different reasons. The first is that the highway, as it was built, the reason why they needed to do so many modifications, and I think modifications is an understatement. These building 53 new turnouts along the highway to accommodate loads of this size. These highways were not made for loads of this size, 600,000 pounds, 30 feet high, over 200 feet long. I think that they weren't made for this, and that's why there needed to be major construction along the highway. And so to answer your question, no, I don't think that they addressed it at the time that they built the highway, and that's why the Department of Transportation decided to do an environmental analysis. And there were some concerns raised over wetlands that would be encroached upon by some of the construction that would go along the route, and so they wouldn't be addressed by that. And additionally, the road right of way doesn't go through private property or through through tribal lands. But if you're extending that right of way, if you're building additional turnouts, then it did, and that is why the Nez Perce and the Siaskay Cree tribe joined in the lawsuit. They were very concerned over impacts to cultural resources.
Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Stang. Maybe a few.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Stang, we're talking a lot about modifications. I've got some knowledge of these. I think we've been referring to the megaloads quite a bit. But they changed their route, most of the megaloads, and I don't believe I remember seeing many modifications along the routes that I took, and I took most of them within the state. Are you familiar with any of the modifications on the highways of the megaloads coming through Montana?
Mr. Chairman, most of the modifications were made at a very high expense to the megaloads themselves. They were cut in half and shipped up through Idaho and across the freeway. Had to be cut in half because the reason they wanted to use the other roads is they were too tall to get under the underpasses in the first place, or overpasses.
Thank you. I have a follow-up on... you might not have the answer to this, but are you familiar with, or do you have any stats on the rather unbelievable economic stimulus these megaloads have brought to our state? I know that when I follow these around,
substantial amount of signage that was done. In our case, the drivers that were moving those were very trained drivers and well paid to move the loads. But if you'd like to refer that to one of them, they probably have a better economic impact than I do.
Thank you, Mr. Stang. A question for Mr. Hegerberg. Similar question, and I'd also like to add that, or ask if most of this economic stimulus comes from out-of-state funding, essentially.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Stang and I actually authored an op-ed piece that ran in various newspapers around the state, and there had been an economic analysis done of the lost economic potential as a result of those initial loads having to be reconfigured and not some of the loads that did not come through the state of Montana, and the figure was $33 million. in lost economic opportunity for the state of Montana. Now, that did not include the cost to Imperial of breaking those loads down in Lewiston, Idaho. And that cost was about $500,000 for each load that was broken down, essentially one module broken into two pieces and transported along a different route. And then, of course, when it got to Alberta, it had to be, reassembled. And what that cost was I do not know.
Thank you, Mr. Hegerberg. One more question. I saw some unbelievable measures being made to, I didn't see any real problems. Are you aware of any major problems that have occurred to property or?
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the question. I mean, our member companies are the ones responsible for making sure that these loads move through the state of Montana. And had it not been for the controversy surrounding these particular loads going, through Highway 12 and then up through Missoula and up into Alberta, most people would have never known they were even going through Missoula. And we have numerous stories about loads that never got any press, never got any media attention, having moved through the state of Montana, and people virtually didn't even know about it. Weyerhaeuser Corporation was building a large biomass facility in Alberta, and they had a huge module also manufactured in Korea, and it moved right through this same route through Missoula, unimpeded, no challenges, no questions asked. But because it was a green energy project, the organizations that seem so intent on challenging.
Chairman, I would really like to have him change his tenor of.
Representative Squires, he's answering the question respectfully.
Talking about the individuals in my town.
Please come to order. Please come to order and let him answer the question. He's being very respectful.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I mean, the reality is the primary challenge using the environmental analysis law in Montana was more related to the impacts on the oil sands of Canada than it was on the actual environmental concerns in the state of Montana. And that was, in our estimation, that's what was driving the whole demand for an environmental review on these permits, and it had not much to do with the actual impacts within the state of Montana and in that highway right-of-way.
Thank you, Mr. Hegerberg.
I have another question, if I could.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm not sure who, maybe the sponsor, could answer my questions. I have a couple.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Smith.
Okay, Chairman, Representative. When on this checklist 1 and 2, it talks about construction, involving construction, earth disturbing, permanent changes. Who pays for those, or who does? Who, if that's required?
Typically, when I was with MDT, we would require whoever was responsible for the cost to bear the cost of those repairs.
Okay, thank you.
It takes from the time they've applied until the permit is issued.
Yes, thank you.
Would anybody know the answer to that?
Mr. Williams.
Ballpark.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Smith, if I understand your question right, how long it takes for an application to be processed for one of these oversized loads, including the MEPA process?
Yes. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, with a completed application, it shouldn't take more than about 5 days.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Wilson.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to have so many questions, but I have some more questions. May I speak with the gentleman from MDT again? Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Williams. Prior to the lawsuit coming your way, who would have paid for the pullouts and changes to the highway that were planned to be on what is it, Highway 2, whatever that is that's down the Locksaw. 12, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, it would have been the company that wanted to do it. So in this case, Exxon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, Representative McChesney, would you like to close on your bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This was kind of a fun one. I enjoyed it. A lot of good questions. Obviously, it's very controversial. As I stated earlier, I spent 32 years with the Department of Transportation, was involved in a number of issuing a number of oversized load permits as a district administrator and a maintenance chief. And in my entire career, I never saw the necessity or the requirement for an environmental review. The fact is that when these mega loads came through initially, and there were obviously a number of adjustments and improvements that needed to be made to the highway infrastructure and associated utilities, that would have required, and today would still require, an environmental review. But were those improvements or relocations, permanent relocations, aren't required, it's frivolous and a unnecessary waste of time to force these companies and make these companies go through any kind of an environmental review. Representative Wilson referenced the fact that these loads are planned well in advance. It doesn't need an environmental review. What it does need is good public notice and good PR. And if that's not being done, which I believe it probably is, I would encourage the Department of Transportation to do that, which I believe they do. I've been involved in a number of similar things, and I know that we go out of our, when I was there, we went out of our way to public notice and ensure the public was involved in these kinds of impacts. You know, the sky isn't falling. The fact is that House Bill 513 simply makes it clear that the legislature never intended routine oversized load permits be forced to undergo the same type of scrutiny for environmental impacts that a new coal mine or an oil refinery would be subject to. Does it mean that all of these loads, again, does it mean that they'd all be exempt? No. Again, when in fact major utility relocations, major lengthy outages, or reconstruction is required, then those things will be addressed through an environmental permit. And with that, Mr. Chair, I would ask for a due pass, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Representative McChesney. This will close the hearing on House Bill 513. Committee members, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then come back in and we'll finish up all our executive actions. So please be back.
I think he's out there.